Start, Mary.
Welcome, everybody. Good evening. I'm very happy to welcome you here to our question and answer session with Heather Clark, who just wrote an exciting new biography of Sylvia Plath called Red Comet, The Short and Blazing Path of Sylvia Plath. My name is Mary Smoyer, and I'm here to welcome you on behalf of the Boston Women's Heritage Trail. For 30 years, the Boston Women's Heritage Trail has been recovering, documenting, and celebrating the history of Boston women. We have 16 self-guided tours on our website, and you're welcome to go there. We hope you will go there, bwht.org, and find out more about us. One of the trails that we developed was on women in Jamaica Plain. And in honor of that trail and those women, for I think 8, maybe even 10 years, the Boston Women's Heritage Trail has been partnering with the Jamaica Plain Historical Society to present the stories of those women in more depth. So far, we have presented Lucy Stone, Pauline Agassiz Shaw, Maud Cuny Hare, Rose Norwood Finkelstein, Edna Dow Cheney, women's clubs, including the Tuesday Club, which owns the Lauren Greeno House, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, Ellen Swallow Richards, Dr. Susan Dimmick, Mother Mary Rogers, and Emily Green Balch. So tonight we're delighted to feature a book about Sylvia Plath, whose family lived on Prince Street in Jamaica Plain when she was born. I hope you enjoy our talk tonight, and thank you very much for coming. Now I'll turn over to Gretchen Grozier, the president of the Jamaica Plain Historical Society.
Thanks, Mary. Hi, everyone. I'm Gretchen Grozier from the Jamaica Plain Historical Society. And as Mary mentioned, we're so excited to have everybody here for our talk tonight with Heather Clark. And we are excited to always partner with the Boston Women's Heritage Trail to do a talk in March for Women's History Month. We had to postpone this one a little bit, and now we're in April, but it's National Poetry Month, so it still fits, which is great. One of the things that we wanted to call your attention to is that Paper Cuts, which is our local independent bookstore here in Jamaica Plain, a woman-owned bookstore, is giving you an offer where you can buy the book tonight, or you can buy the book from them, and it's a 20% discount. We send out links in the email that you got with a Zoom link, and we'll put that in the chat. And if you use the code JPHS20, you can get that special deal, and we hope you will, because we'd like to support our local bookstore. And since I have a captive audience of hundreds of people, I wanted to just point out that Jamaica Plain is a neighborhood in the city of Boston. So those of you who aren't from the area, you've probably heard of maybe Beacon Hill or Dorchester. Those are other neighborhoods in Boston. We're a smaller neighborhood, but we like to think that we're very rich in history. And one of the things the JP Historical Society tries to do is preserve and really promote the history of Jamaica Plain. And we do that in the winter time and in the spring through events like this. And so we've got a few coming up still this year, or this before the summer. In just a week and a half, we have a talk on the remarkable photos of Leon Abdalian. Leon Abdalian was an Armenian immigrant who arrived in Jamaica Plain. He actually came from the Ottoman Empire, his early 20th century, and was a self-taught photographer, but eventually, after retiring from his entire career working on the Boston Elevated, became pretty well known and took pictures for National Geographic and other really major magazines. And we've been trying to have a talk about him for quite some time. The Boston Public Library has a collection, but they had to digitize it, so we had to wait for that. And then we finally got Aaron Schmidt to have a date. It was in the spring of 2020, and that got canceled. And then we've actually had to reschedule once more because Aaron couldn't get into his office still, but he has been able to get in, and that talk is happening on Sunday, the 25th. We also have a talk in May, another book talk that's about from our city archaeologist, Joe Bagley. He's written a book called Boston's Oldest Buildings and Where to Find Them. And several of the buildings from pre-1800 are in Jamaica Plain, and he'll come and talk about those on Tuesday, the 25th of May. And then hot off the presses, another event that we're actually sponsoring with the Boston Women's Heritage Trail is a film screening that will be actually hosted by the Boston Public Library here in Jamaica Plain, the Jamaica Plain branch, on Saturday the 5th. It's about Blanche Ames, who was a suffragist. She's actually from the southeast of Massachusetts, but she has an interesting connection to Jamaica Plain. So we hope that you will sign up for that and watch that film and learn more about her and her connections. More details on that will follow, so that's not quite up on the website yet. And then finally, we are starting walking tours. So we do a weekly walking tour every Saturday throughout the summer, starting a little bit later than normal this year. We're starting May 22nd, just because we're hoping more and more people will be vaccinated. So if we push it back a little bit, we'll get even more people over that line. So you can sign up for all those events and check them out on our website at jphs.org/events. And then other ways that you can connect with us, you can sign up. We have a monthly e-newsletter. So we'll let you know what we're doing, new things that have gone up on our website, anything that's going on that speaks to the history of Jamaica Plain. You can also follow us on social media if that's your thing. We're on Insta, Facebook, and Twitter. And you can always become a member. All of our events are free and open to the public, and all of the things that we do to try and sort of get the word out about Jamaica Plain's history, those are supported by dues paying members. So if you go to our website, you can become a member. I chose the little slide, the little postcard that you see here, because it's a early 20th century view of Jamaica Plain. This is Monument Square. It looks pretty similar. We don't have trolleys anymore, but it's right down the street from Prince Street, where Sylvia Plath was born. So it's a view she as a child may have seen and known. So the last instruction, the logistics of tonight, we're in webinar format, so we can't see you. We don't have chat or raise hand enabled. We just want you to use the Q&A button. It's at the bottom of your screen. And if you put your questions in there, once Heather's done talking, we'll try and get through as many questions as we can. So we're pretty excited about having Heather Clark come and speak. We knew that there was this new biography of Sylvia Plath out, and we figured we'd reach out and ask her because we're virtual. And even though she splits her time between Chappaqua, New York, and England, where she's a professor, we figured it was worth a try. And she said yes, so that's exciting. And also, she has a JP connection. Her grandmother was born in Jamaica Plain and was here as a child, so very similar to the story of Sylvia Plath. I don't want to go through all of her accolades. I want to give you time to hear from Heather, but I am very fascinated that she's recently served as a consultant for the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation. They're doing a documentary about Sylvia Plath. So again, you can ask the questions in the Q&A, and if somebody wants to ask about that, that would be fascinating. But with that, I'm going to turn it over and take it away, Heather.
Thank you, and thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about Sylvia Plath in a Boston-based forum. And I myself was raised in Massachusetts, and my parents both grew up in the greater Boston area. They grew up in Medford. So it brings it all home in a way. I am not going to give a written formal lecture tonight. I thought I would just sort of speak more informally to you all about why I decided to write this book, and maybe touch on some of the challenges and the joys and things like that. I did give a formal lecture on Sylvia Plath and the writing of this biography to the Oxford Center for Life Writing, and you can access that on the Oxford Center for Life Writing website if you feel like listening to that. But as I say tonight, I'll just speak more informally. So this is the book, Red Comet, The Short Life and Blazing Art of Sylvia Plath. It took me about 8 years to write. It turned out to be a lot longer than I thought it would be, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But just going back to how I came to Sylvia Plath and why I decided to write the book, I wrote my PhD on Northern Irish poets, and particularly Northern Irish poets who were writing in Belfast during the Troubles in Northern Ireland in the 1960s and 1970s. And so hearing that, people often say like, well, how did you get to Sylvia Plath from Seamus Heaney? and the progression is actually less random than it seems, because Seamus Heaney, who was one of the main poets I was writing about, he was very close to Ted Hughes, Sylvia Plath's husband. And so I sort of came to Plath through the back door, not necessarily through, I would say, a feminist lens, which I kind of have now, but through an Irish poetry, English poetry lens. And so I began becoming more interested in Ted Hughes because of his connection to Seamus Heaney. And Seamus Heaney actually said that reading Ted Hughes gave him the confidence to become a poet. So there was a really strong connection between those two that kind of fascinated me. Now, around the time I'm working on all of this in graduate school at Oxford, I was asked to teach a series of tutorials on Sylvia Plath. And this made me very nervous because I didn't feel qualified to teach Sylvia Plath's work. I don't think I read any of Sylvia Plath as a student in high school, which sounds amazing because it sounds ridiculous because most people come to Plath through the bell jar, usually in high school, but I had no recollection of reading her, and I don't think I read her in college. I mean, the only woman poet I remember reading in any serious depth at Harvard was Emily Dickinson, which is not to say that there weren't classes offered on Plath and Sexton, but I just don't recall ever engaging seriously with her as a poet before I was asked to teach that class. And Plath was actually somebody who was on the Oxford University set curriculum for undergraduates. And I remember being kind of surprised by that when I was asked to teach her work, because I think I had sort of fallen prey to this myth of Plath as her synonymous with madness and tragedy and depression and suicide and the real dark aspects of her story. And I think even by that time, I didn't necessarily take her as seriously as I should have. So anyway, I taught these tutorials. I fell in love with her poetry. I realized when I engaged deeply, with Ariel and the Colossus and a lot of these other poems, what an incredibly sophisticated, cerebral, ironic, witty, humorous poet I was dealing with. And I just struggled to keep up with her and her intelligence. And the more immersed in her work I became, sort of the angrier I became about this sort of reductive idea, this cliche of Sylvia Plath as the doomed, hysterical poet. And so anyway, I ended up writing my second book on Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes and their poetic relationship, I guess you would call it. I sort of stayed away from biography in my second book, which was called The Grief of Influence. I was very interested in how Plath and Hughes, who I consider two of the greatest poets of the post-war generation, I mean, how did they influence each other as poets? I mean, that was the main question I tried to answer in that book. So that book took me about 5 years or so to write. And while I was writing it, I felt like I had a good critical foundation to pursue another book just on Plath. And I had been toying with the idea of writing a biography on Plath, but I always talked myself out of it. At the time, I mean, we're talking around 2010, 2011, there were already about 8 or 9 biographies. And, but I did feel that a lot of them pathologized her and really focused on the more sensational aspects of her mental illness and her suicide. Not all of them, but a lot of them did. And kind of approached her ambition, I felt, in a fairly sexist way, sort of equating her ambition with neurosis almost. And so these earlier biographies, some of them really annoyed me. Uh, but at the same time, I had read Janet Malcolm's book, The Silent Woman, about Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes. And in that book, Janet Malcolm famously uh, just, I mean, she puts out this idea that biography writing in general is almost unethical. And she compares biographers to people, you're going through private possessions, stealing stories and things like this. She presents a very unattractive view of biography. And her case study is Plath biography. And so she goes through all of these stories, people who tried to write Plath's biography and had nervous breakdowns and never finished their manuscripts. And it's very chilling reading if you're someone who's thinking about writing a biography of Sylvia Plath, let's put it that way. It's a very well-written book, but I always had it, I sort of had Janet Malcolm whispering in one ear, like, don't do this. But then I had whispering in the other ear, Hermione Lee. And Hermione Lee's Virginia Woolf biography was, for me, it was so enabling and so inspiring. And I almost think of it as the Platonic ideal of the biography, the sort of biography that I wanted to write. And Hermione Lee has a quote that has inspired me, and it really kept me writing through the years. And I should have, if I had a bulletin board over my computer, I would have pinned this quote up. But the quote is something like, "Women whose lives have involved mental illness, abuse, self-harm, and suicide are often treated biographically as victims or case histories first, and as professional writers second." And I remember reading those words and just thinking, yes. And then it became sort of clear to me that if I tried to write a Plath biography, that is what I wanted to do. I wanted to treat Plath as, in Lee's words, a professional writer first. And that idea really galvanized me. And I decided that I would give it a try. Now, I should also mention that there was new material. There was a lot of new material. And coming down the pike, I knew that Plath's surviving letters were going to be published by Faber and Faber in 2018. And I knew that would be a game changer in Plath scholarship. Now, I had been to the archives and I had taken photos of thousands of letters myself. So I had most of them on my computer anyway, but just to have a book that you can check, you can look in the index and you can go to a certain letter. It makes things much easier for a biographer. So I knew that 2 huge volumes of Plath's letters were coming down the pike. And I also knew, just having dealt with Ted Hughes's archives for my second book, I knew there was a lot more there to mine. He left his papers to mostly to the British Library and Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. And so this was around, I'd say, early 2000s. So I just knew there was more there, and I was excited to kind of dig in. And also, I felt like, after having written 2 academic books, that I wanted to write for a wider audience, frankly. And there had been so much really good Plath scholarship over the past 10 or 15 years. I felt like there was almost a renaissance of Plath scholarship that really portrayed her as just a much more ironic writer, and tried to, scholarship that really tried to make us understand that she's playing with this idea of confessionalism. She's always kind of labeled a confessional poet, but a lot of work has really tried to kind of, I guess, complicate that notion. And I thought maybe a biography would be a good way of getting some of those fantastic ideas that I'd read in my colleagues' work kind of out in a more digestible form. So to me, biography seemed like a good vehicle for the kind of public scholarship that I guess I wanted to do by that point. I think I've always wanted to tell stories through my scholarship, and always gravitated a bit to biography, which is tough when you're an academic, because you're trained as an English literature scholar to not look to biography for the meaning of a poem or a short story or a novel. That's sort of taboo. You don't necessarily do that. So I was trained to to eschew all that. So to go and then write this enormous biography is almost like a betrayal of my my field. But I do think of people like Hermione Lee and Robert Caro and Lyndall Gordon, and I mean, I really think of them as important public scholars who are raising the bar in terms of conversations about these great writers. So so I got myself a literary agent and I wrote up a proposal, and I ended up selling the book to Knopf, and I signed the contract in January 2012. And I turned the book in January 2019. The book was supposed to be about 500 or 600 pages. And it turned out to be double that length almost. I mean, I don't quite understand what possessed me to go into such granular detail about Sylvia Plath's life. And I can't really explain it except to say that once you start writing in a very detailed way, it's sort of hard to stop writing in that way. And also, as I said before, there's just so much new material to work with. And also new papers, new archival collections came to light as I was working. So that was just serendipitous. So I really had a lot more to work with than previous biographers. And it was easier to deal with the Plath estate, which was no longer run by Olwen Hughes, who was Ted Hughes's sister and who famously disliked Sylvia Plath. So while I was writing, the Plath estate was sort of run by Ted and Sylvia's daughter, Frida. So it was just, that was easier. And also I think feelings were less raw. There's still a lot of people around who knew Plath, especially in the Boston area. So I spent a lot of time interviewing people all around New England who had been to Wellesley High with her, or who had been to Smith with her, or who just grew up with her in Wellesley. So, and they were fantastic to talk to. I mean, they had talked to a lot of Plath biographers, but it's still, there's still something amazing sitting in front of one of Sylvia Plath's friends and asking her questions. And I just really appreciate the generosity I was shown by her contemporaries. I went over to England quite a bit while I was researching to the British Library. And I spent a summer up in West Yorkshire as a visiting professor at the university where I now work full time, the University of Huddersfield. They have a Ted Hughes center, and they're really involved in promoting Hughes and Plath and the Brontes, because the university is sort of squarely in that wonderful geographic location. So I spent about 5 or 6 weeks living in Ted Hughes's childhood home in the village of Mytholmroyd in West Yorkshire. And I was able to follow in Plath and Hughes's footsteps and go for these long walks on the moors, and really kind of immerse myself in that beautiful West Yorkshire landscape. And that was one of the real highlights for me in terms of just researching the book. It really gave me a much deeper sense of what Plath as an American woman was facing in that environment. So, and also she wrote a lot of poems about that landscape and that, so experiencing those walks and just that culture, frankly, it helped me kind of understand. It helped open up the poems to me as well, not just the life. So, so this book grew and it grew and it grew some more. And I stopped figuring out the word counts. I think at one point it was over 500,000 words, which is, 16 or 1700 pages, double spaced. And I gave this draft to my editor at Knopf, and she really helped me get it down. You might think it's still quite long, but it was actually much longer. Most of what we cut was from the first half of the book, and which I actually had thought about asking for a 2-volume book, but they didn't go for it. So I would say almost everything from sort of the time she goes to Cambridge on is as it was, and as I said, most of what's been cut was from the first half, her childhood and adolescence. But I thought it was really important to go over that time in her life, because that had generally been the time that had been ignored in previous biographies, and I really wanted to dig in, especially to her juvenilia, which again had been almost completely ignored, not just by biographers, but by scholars. And as I was writing, the question that I always came back to was, how did Sylvia Plath become the writer that she became? Because I really wanted to tell this story, the story of her writing journey, and I wanted to highlight her determination to become a great writer, because that was the story that she so clearly tells about herself. I thought on almost every page of her journal and letters, it's not necessarily depression. It's this desire to become a writer, and a great writer at that, and this sort of beautiful ambition. And so that was if I had a thesis, right, that was sort of my thesis. That was the line that I tried to stay with through all of the book. And that's the question that I would keep coming back to when I was overwhelmed just by the pure amount of archival material I was dealing with, thousands and thousands of pages, letters, manuscripts, things like that. I would always just try to come back to that question. And it's a very simple question: how did she become the writer that she became? But just keeping the focus on the writing, and on her fulfilling her literary vocation. That was really important to me. But it was a challenge, and I have to say, sometimes I felt like I was sailing through Scylla and Charybdis, because on the one hand, I did not want to sensationalize the life or the death in the ways that I felt it had been sensationalized in the past, because society loves the spectacle of a woman falling apart. I mean, that sells books. Look at Britney Spears. I mean, Britney Spears was in the news, what was it, last month or the month before? Just this kind of reckoning, the media feasted on her dissolution. And I remember reading the articles about her in the Times a couple months ago and sort of thinking to myself, like, something similar happened to Plath. And so, I wanted to avoid that. I wanted to avoid the train wreck and the freak show and all of that. And Plath herself, in her poem, Lady Lazarus, that is such a wonderfully ironic poem about confessionalism. In the poem, the speaker performs this sort of ghastly striptease, and the people have come and paid to watch her commit suicide. And Plath almost turns the mirror back on us as voyeurs, and she sort of forces us to ask ourselves these questions about, our own voyeuristic impulses as an audience. So I had that in my mind as well. Plath, it was almost like she foresaw what would happen to her image and her legacy. So you don't want to sensationalize, but I also didn't want to sanitize. I didn't want to make her into this airbrushed feminist saint, because she wasn't. And Plath really cherished what she called her weirdnesses. And I wanted to honor that aspect of her. I didn't want to sort of sand down her rough edges. And also dealing with mental illness, it was the same thing. I didn't want to make that the whole story, right? Which had been done, but I also didn't want to sort of pretend that it didn't happen and whitewash it, because depression was a huge part of her life, and depression took her life. So again, just trying to navigate through those shoals, that was always a challenge writing the book, thematically. And then of course, one of the other thematic challenges was just to keep the reader interested, right? And to keep the reader turning those pages. And I was always very cognizant of that as I wrote, that it was my responsibility to keep the reader engaged. And so I was always very nervous that my scholarly language would creep in, and I didn't want readers to fall asleep. And this became an issue when I was working with the poems, because it's like, how do you perform literary criticism on the page in a biography? And are the readers just going to skip forward? So I tried to make the explications of the poems as interesting as I could and as I thought they should be. I just didn't want to skip that, because why do we care about Sylvia Plath? We care about her because she was a great writer. So I didn't want to just kind of run through the work in that way. I did want to linger on the poems and the short stories and the bell jar. And so there is literary criticism kind of woven into the biography. So, I mean, it turned out it's about 3 inches. I think the spine is about 3 inches in the American edition. The British edition is a little bit thinner. But there seems to be an audience for a 1,000-page book about Sylvia Plath, and I'm really heartened by that. I just had no idea how this would be received. So I'm glad the book seems to have found its readers. And I have to say that writing this book was really, it was just a joy from start to finish. I felt enormously lucky to be doing this work and to kind of spend my days trying to reconstruct Sylvia Plath's life in this way. And it never got old. It never got boring. I mean, it really got me out of bed in the morning. And I had young children while I was writing this book. I still have youngish children. I had a baby in the middle of it. Actually, not in the middle. I was about 2 years in. And I already had a daughter. She was 3 when I started. And then my son was born, as I say, about a couple years into the book. So that was a challenge. I mean, just showing up with young children and organizing the research trips, the childcare for that was, again, a logistical challenge. Luckily, my mother was really helpful there. And, but I have to say, it's one of the ways that I really connected with Plath, just as a mother, because she was someone who had 2 young children, and she was sort of, I really identified with her struggle to find the time to write with young children afoot. And so I would have these kind of strange meta moments where I'm writing, I'm a mother with 2 young children, sort of stealing time to writing about Plath with her 2 young children, stealing time to write. So those were some of the the moments that I really really connected with her. And she actually ended up inspiring me in that way. Her sort of discipline and determination to keep showing up and to keep writing, of course, until she couldn't, until she was just laid low by depression. So I think, I think of her, people sometimes ask me, how did your understanding of Sylvia Plath change from the beginning of this project to the end? And I would say that it did, and that I didn't realize quite how hard she would have to fight to kind of maintain or get this position in Anglo-American literature in the first place, and then sort of maintain it throughout her life. And just so many walls that she came up against over and over. You read about kind of the sexism of the 1950s, but it was another thing to really become engrossed in that and to just realize how hard it was for women writers to break through. And yeah, how hard she had to work. And to me, she seemed like a fighter. And that is not the way that most people think of Sylvia Plath. And I think even I, maybe at the beginning of the project, thought of her as more fragile, and I didn't quite appreciate the toughness that was there most of the time when she wasn't suffering from depression. There was just a core of real toughness and stoicism and determination and will. And I hope that comes through in the book. So anyway, I've been talking for a while. I'm happy to open it up to any questions that people have.
Thank you. That was fantastic. There are plenty of questions, so we'll try and get through as many as we can. I don't think we'll get through them all, but so one of the first ones here, there's a couple actually that are sort of asking about what's the best way, what's the entry point into getting to understand Sylvia Plath? What is a place where you could start if you were going to read Plath? What would you suggest?
Oh, yeah, I go back and forth between the bell jar and Ariel. Maybe the bell jar, actually, because I think the bell jar, it's sort of easier to get through. I think of it as one of the great protest novels, actually, of the 20th century. I think it's an extraordinary critique of the Eisenhower era, and particularly the repressions that women endured in the Eisenhower era, but also other minorities as well. It's a very political novel. It's a novel about the Cold War. I mean, it's always sort of marketed as this college girl suicide novel, but to me, again, it's extremely political. The first sentence is about the execution of the Rosenbergs, and it's just like the politics of that novel are hiding in plain sight. So I think that does give you a good sense of what she was trying to do, sort of politically. And I think of her as someone who, yes, she's a confessional poet, but that doesn't necessarily mean that she wasn't interested in politics and history and that sort of thing. I think there's often this charge of narcissism, right, that comes with this definition of confessional poetry, that these poets are only interested in themselves and their inner worlds and their inner crises. And that wasn't necessarily true for Plath. And that was sort of another thing that I wanted to argue in my book. So I think the bell jar is a way into that side of her. And then I would recommend Ariel, her poems. That Ariel was published in 1965 posthumously by Ted Hughes, and Ted Hughes sort of rearranged the order of the poems, which was very controversial. But the book has been reordered to her original order, and you can now read both versions. But the poems are brilliant. They're difficult. I mean, nothing with Plath should ever come easy, but yeah.
Sort of along those lines, a former president of the JP Historical Society chimes in to tell you that first she's read the first quarter of your book. She thinks it's beautifully written and wonderfully researched. And
Thank
she
you.
says that Sylvia is always called a poet and she's not recognized for her prose except for the bell jar. Do you think her prose is overlooked and should not be? Or was it just not as skilled as her poetry?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was overlooked. And just recently in 2019, a short story was published by Faber and Faber called Mary Ventura and the Ninth Kingdom. It was a Plath short story that she had written in 1953 and then sort of revised it in 54 and 55. But it had been sitting in the archive for 50 years. And it's a brilliant story. And it really, there's a lot of foreshadowing in that short story that goes on. And I think you can kind of draw a line from that to Johnny Panic and the Bible of Dreams and to the Bell Jar. So I think part of the reason her short stories have been overlooked is because they're I think that the book Johnny Panic and the Bible of Dreams, it's hard to get. It might even be out of print. And and Ted Hughes was the one who kind of arranged them and chose them. And I think we could probably do with another edition of her short fiction because there's a ton of unpublished material in the archives. I mean, I'm telling you, story after story. I write a lot about her short stories in the book, her juvenilia, like her high school short stories. And I mean, they may not be her finest work, but they're still really interesting. But no, I think of her as a fiction writer, as a novelist, as a poet too. I mean, personally, I like the poetry best. For me, that's where she really stands out. But I'm biased because I'm a poetry scholar. So
That's fine.
yeah.
Now there's a couple questions that have come in about those archives. Are there more things out there to be found? Where are those archives? And then there's somebody asking about some of the stuff having her archival material having been destroyed by members of Ted's family, perhaps?
Yeah, I can talk about all of that. So her main archives are at Smith College and Indiana University at the Lilly Library. And there are smaller archives around, but those are really the two where you'll find 90% of it. And there is so much there that hasn't been unpublished. I'm sorry, that hasn't been published. All kinds of college poems, college stories. But the good news is that there are two scholars who are currently working on a new edition of Sylvia Plath's poems. Their names are Karen Kukiel, who you might know. She edited Plath's journals and letters, and she's been at Smith forever. Karen Kukiel and Amanda Golden. As we speak, they are putting together a new collected poems that will include much more of the unpublished juvenilia. Because the collected poems we have right now more or less starts in 1956, the one that Ted Hughes put together. And so her juvenilia, there's some juvenilia in it, but not nearly enough, I think. So that is in the works, and we will have that soon. There's also going to be a new Sylvia Plath collected prose, which will again feature more of her unpublished stories and newspaper articles, because she wrote for a bunch of different newspapers when she was at Smith. She was just so incredibly efficient. I mean, the things that she did, she just wrote scores of newspaper articles that until recently were not attributed to her. So there's a scholar, Peter Steinberg, who has done the work and figured out which newspaper articles she wrote for these Western Massachusetts papers and identified it all. So that will be coming in a collected prose. Now, as for the burning of the manuscripts, so Ted Hughes said that he burned Plath's last journal because he said he did not want her children to ever have to read what she wrote in her last entries. But then at a certain point, he wrote to a literary scholar and said, actually, he had not burned the journal, and he just said he had, and that it still existed. So We don't know. We just don't know. And I think he probably did burn the last journal. Maybe I think it probably would have turned up by now. But also Plath's last novel has disappeared. Part of her last, she wrote about half of a novel before she died, and it was around, and then somehow it started disappearing. Chapters were disappearing here and there, and Hughes wrote to other people, sort of frustrated by, like, I don't know what happened to chapter X. He suggested that people stole a lot of her unpublished work over the years when they came to visit and things like that. So we're still waiting. Her last novel, it might still exist. We don't know. And the other, she burned her last, she burned a novel that she had written after the bell jar. This is according to her mother. So after Ted Hughes left her in the summer of 1962, Sylvia's mother, Aurelia, said that she witnessed Plath burning all of this novel that had been a sort of peon to Hughes, and about their wonderful romantic story, and she just sort of fed it to the fire, according to Aurelia Plath. So, yeah.
There's a question about how did you arrive at the title for the book, Red Comet?
Yeah, so I actually did not arrive at this title. It was my editor. Full credit goes to my editor. So my title for 7 years of this book's existence was The Light of the Mind, a biography of Sylvia Plath or something like that. I hadn't figured out the subtitle, but I'd wanted to focus on, I liked the two words light and mind that were in the title, because that was sort of part of my theme, refocusing on light rather than darkness, and sort of her cerebral nature and her artfulness rather than this sort of impulsivity that I think sometimes gets ascribed to confessional poets. But anyway, my editor didn't think she just thought it was too subtle, and it wasn't quite bold enough. And so we went through a lot of other different titles, and she just really wanted something short and bold, and that would help sell, a 1,000-page book. And I trusted their marketing instincts over my own. Academic titles are usually pretty long with colons and that sort of thing. So. And it's, by the way, the title is from Stings, from Plath's poem Stings. And we ended up putting the poem in the very beginning of the book because I didn't trust that everyone would know that reference. And I remember my editor saying, like, oh no, everybody knows that. They know that's Plath. But I wasn't sure that people would. And let's just say there were a lot of jokes from my son about Marvel comics and things like that. So and there were, communist comments, anything red. So we put the poem in the beginning.
Great. I think it's a great title. I love it.
Yeah,
me personally, as if that matters.
Yeah.
There are a couple questions that are about misconceptions you uncovered, surprises that came as you did your research. Were there things that you found that you were surprised at, or things that were misconceptions that you were able to rectify?
Yeah, I felt like that was almost my daily mission. It was just turning that tanker of Sylvia Plath, synonymous with madness and tragedy, and this idea. I quote Maggie Nelson in my introduction, and she says, "To be the Sylvia Plath of anything is a bad thing." And I don't know that that's true now. I think when I started writing, it was more true, and this was before Me Too, and but yeah, just this condescension, I guess it was almost from the media, and yeah, as I say, turning that tanker and just getting us to take her and her work more seriously as one of the most important writers of certainly of the post-war generation, but even the 20th century. So, I mean, I'm just trying to think of very specific instances. I feel like, well, for me, I guess I was most surprised by a lot of the medical stuff. Um, uh, Knowing, just reading these letters that had never been read before, and before they were published in 2018, about her fear of institutionalization, and about her last letter, which she wrote a few days before her suicide. She wrote this to her psychiatrist, and she talks in that letter about her fear of, and I quote, a mental hospital and lobotomies. And I hadn't I hadn't quite realized the terror that she would feel, and she it being on the cusp of another institutionalization. And she had spoken with her doctor, and her doctor wanted to put her into a psychiatric hospital in London, and there wasn't going to be the money from McLean in London, right? It was going to be, as she thought, her word was Dickensian. And this was not going to be Olive Higgins Prouty like taking her to McLean in a limousine, which is what happened the first time. And she knew that. And so I think that terror made me reinterpret maybe her reasons for suicide a bit. And also I learned more about the drugs that she was on at the end of her life from one of these archival collections that I mentioned earlier that opened in early 2020, the Harriet Rosenstein collection, which is now at Emory University. Rosenstein, she started a Plath biography in the 1970s, but she never finished. She interviewed scores and scores of people. Her research was fantastic, and I and many other Plath scholars, we are the beneficiaries because she sold all of it to Emory. And I was able, it was like a time capsule, these memories from 1970, 1971, when people's memories were so fresh. So I learned a lot of new information from that collection, which is all in the book. Thank God Knopf let me do some last minute edits. And anyway, so there was a lot more information in that collection about her medical treatment and about specific drugs that she was taking, and all of that, and about the really bad shock treatment she had had at Valley Head Hospital in Carlisle, which some of you might be familiar with. It's not there anymore, but she had really suffered. It became clear to me that she had really suffered from psychiatric negligence in many ways, and that part of the story I hadn't expected so much. So yeah, when I got to that last searing letter that she wrote, just about her fear of being institutionalized again, it was almost like a rational decision. She was really terrified of what would happen to her. And again, remember, she's virtually friendless in London in 1963. It's winter. Her husband's left her. She's got 2 babies. Intermittent heat and electricity going on and off. It was such a bad time. And then she's facing this prospect of being institutionalized. So yeah, I think the medical part of the story was maybe the most surprising to me, and made me reinterpret, I think, the most. And postpartum depression, that was, sorry, just add that. I think that was also part of the story that hadn't really been acknowledged before. So I tried, and again, I'm not a psychiatrist, so I'm very wary of making any kind of grand claims, but I think that we at least need to allow for the possibility that some of these treatments made her worse and could have exacerbated her depression. Certainly the first round of shock treatments made her worse. And then a lot of the drugs she was on at the end of her life, they had these very ill understood interactions, but just allow for that possibility that the treatments were, as in Virginia Woolf's case, similar thing happened.
Somebody heard me and asked a question about the BBC documentary that you consulted on. Is that coming out soon, and will it be available to American audiences?
Yes, that was in 2018, and the title is Sylvia Plath, Life Inside the Bell Jar. It was broadcast in England on the BBC in June of 2018. And she's having, the director is Teresa Griffiths. She's having a lot of trouble getting permissions for an American, like releasing it in the United States for some reason. So last I heard, it will probably be released in Canada soon, but she's still trying to deal with a lot of red tape because there are a lot of images that she uses, and she's having a bit of a hard time. So I don't know. I wish it was out here. Yeah, I was a scholarly consultant on that. So.
And then I think just to finish up, are you working on a new book, and what is that project?
Yes, I'm about 50 pages into it. It is a group biography of sorts of Anne Sexton, Sylvia Plath, Maxine Cumin, and Adrienne Rich in Boston in the 50s and 60s. And I might get a little bit into the 70s, but right now I'm sort of focused on Robert Lowell's seminar in 1959, and that moment in American literature where confessionalism really explodes onto the scene. And I'm interested in the intersection of poetic confessionalism and second wave feminism, which also exploded around the same time, a little bit later. But I'm very interested in how some of these women poets, how those two things intersected in their work. And I'm interested in their friendships and rivalries and all of that. So that is coming out with Knopf, hopefully in a few years. Once the archives need to open. Harvard needs to open its archive. So
we'll put a word in.
Yeah.
All right. There are more questions, but I think in the interest of time and everybody's got things to do, we'll call it a day. But thank you. Is there anything else, Heather, that you want to add, that you thought of, that you're good?
No, just thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk about Plath.
Yeah, thank you so much for writing about her. And I'm sure there are lots of comments. I put a few in the chat for you of just how great the book is and how people are really enjoying it. And I must say I am too, although I have not quite finished, but I'm working my way through. And it's, I thought I knew a lot about it, Plath, and I'm realizing I didn't. So it's a wonderful book. And
that's a good outcome of a biography, I think. Yeah.
Exactly. So the accolades are well deserved. So thank you so much for your time and for joining us tonight. And thank you, everybody. And we will see you hopefully soon. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.